So thank you all for coming today, and thank you, Mike, for coming down to visit us. And Drew, I'll welcome you to introduce Mike formally, and we'll begin the program.
Well, it's my privilege to introduce our speaker, historian, and educator, Mike McLeod. Mike has received a BA at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a teaching certificate at the University of Puget Sound. He has worked as an educator at Horton Squally Living History Museum for 19 years. At the Fort, Mike develops and teaches classroom programs and has been actively involved in developing many of the living history exhibits found at Horton Squally. And may I add that Horton Squally is really well known for its popular living history days and other events. And today, Mike's going to be talking about a really fascinating period of time and a person. And you see the title up here, but I think this is a person that has been written off sometimes as being a troublemaker, but we'll find out the truth today. So it's my honor to introduce Mike McLeod.
Well, thank you very much, Drew. That's very nice. Thank you. Wow. That's very nice. Thank you. And I've always, thank you for inviting me. I know when I'm invited here and can speak before this audience, I know I'm going to, it's a real quality group of people, good historians here. My name is Mike McGuire, and I work at Horton Squally Living History Museum in Point Defiance Park in Tacoma. Today, I think most of us are familiar. If we haven't been there, if you've been there, raise your hand. Just say, who's been? Okay, just oh, well, good. That's unanimous in everybody. Now, the question that I'm going to first ask here is anybody here ever read any part of or heard of Joseph Heath? I'm just getting a feel for my, just kind of see where everybody is. Okay. Horton Squally just recently formed what we call the Literary Society. And the purpose of the Horton Squally Literary Society is to have all the volunteers have an opportunity to explore in depth literature pertaining to the history of Horton Squally. The first piece of literature that we looked at, and it was pretty much unanimous, was something that was known as a Joseph Heath journal or diary. The reason that we picked this particular item is that it's a primary source, and it documents the experience of an HBC tenant farmer whose name was Joseph Thomas Heath. It was also significant in that it covers the 1845 to 1849 time frame, which is fairly early when you look at from a Euro-American experience on the Puget Sound. It also provides many details of the daily human condition of people who were living on the Puget Sound in this time and place. And lastly, and this is, I think, the main reason why I really enjoy the diary, and I encourage anybody to read it, it's personal, forthright, honest, emotional, and funny. So that's why I tend to refer to it as a diary. I think Heath himself calls it a journal, but because of the fact that by definition a diary implies a certain amount of personalness getting into your writing, I will refer to it as a Joseph Heath diary. All right, I get to use this. Oh, it worked. Okay, Joseph Thomas Heath, and that's a picture of him. When I first thought about Thomas Heath, the first word that came into my mind is complex. He's a complex man. He came from an established English family. His father was a comfortable farmer. He was a freeman farmer. He owned his land. He was the eldest of 13 children. He was educated and he was schooled in farming. So he was an excellent farmer. After Heath's father's death, one of his biographers will blame it on riotous behavior, gambling, or just plain bad business decisions. Heath would squander his family fortune and that of his mother and sister, and also lose the farm. Heath's debt and indebtedness will become public, and he will be plagued by debt collectors in England. So what does a 40-year-old man in England do when you're in this situation? Well, who knows, was he desperate? But he signed a contract to become a tenant farmer in the Northwest for the Hudson's Bay Company at this time. So to go back to the original, let's see if this works, hardly a scapegrace. And this is where I'm going to introduce the definition. Well, what does scapegrace mean? I had to look it up. And this biographer who was writing about Heath said, she uses the expression, and it means a complete rogue or rascal. And I feel like those are pretty strong words, okay? Maybe to his debtors, and maybe his sister and his mother, he was a scapegrace. And that's the way I think Heath was kind of kept until his diary was discovered again. It was kind of like halfway hidden until 1934 would it be transcribed. So the question has to be asked, did Heath travel to the Northwest to escape his money tormentors, or just, I'm just going to say, just to get out of Dodge, just get out of town, you know? Or was he making an honest attempt to square his debts and to make things right? My opinion was that he was trying to make things right, because his diary will reveal that he's hardworking, intelligent, brave, and as I said, he was making a sincere attempt to make things right. So I would go more with the opinion that he was hardly a scapegrace. All right. He'll leave England in 1843, and he'll arrive on the mouth of the Columbia Bar in June of 1844. He'll proceed to the Hudson's Bay Company, Fort Vancouver, and then he'll go back down the Columbia, up the Cowlitz, and by horseback, you know, where the Cowlitz landing there, where it crosses I-5, he'll go from there to Horton Squally in a day by horseback. Now, if you can picture that I-5 whistling along, he does that in a day. And he makes a notation, quote, a performance of no frequent occurrence. He'll write that about himself. And I think that kind of gives a show into his character that he was a driven man, and he wasn't lazy by any stretch of the imagination. So what was the southern Puget Sound like in the mid-1840s that he's coming into? The principal settlement was Horton Squally, located on the plains of DuPont. Okay, where present-day DuPont, Washington is. I think we're familiar with that. It was established in 1832. Another settlement was the Cowlitz Farm near present-day Tenino, and that was the tillage arm of the Hudson's Bay Company to grow wheat for the Russian contract. So you have those two main settlements. The Euro-Americans were made up of Scots, French Canadians, British, and we had non-Euro-American Hawaiians were very much involved with the fur trade on the Puget Sound. Of course, there was the Native Americans. And Heath will mention Cowlitz, Nisqually, Puyallups, Snoqualmie, Skagit, and Iroquois. And the reason is that the Hudson's Bay Company would bring, you're familiar, would bring Iroquois across with them as they came across the North American continent. So the Iroquois are in the Northwest. He talks about one Iroquois Indian who was very competent and would set the horribly broken leg of a young Indian boy. He had a tree land on him. Dr. Ptolemy had trouble setting it. It was too swollen. Dr. Ptolemy will leave, and the Iroquois Indian will set the young boy's leg himself. So he was very, very capable. In 1843, you have the Great Migration. 700 to 1,000 immigrants are heading for the Northwest. They will be arriving, but most are going to go to the Willamette. That's the prime land. In 1845, you have Michael T. Simmons, and his party will arrive, establishing new market at the tumwater of the Deschutes. Is that what it is? The Deschutes River? Okay. All right. After some exploration, Heath will go as far as Vancouver's Island, and then he will return, and he will select a site that today is present-day historic Fort Steilacoom. All right? And this picture here, and I get to use my little pointer. These buildings here, there, and there. Now, this is Fort Steilacoom, so I'm jumping you ahead post Heath. But in this particular drawing of the fort, these dark buildings, these are all military buildings that we built later, but these buildings here indicate the Heath buildings. So if you go to historic Fort Steilacoom, you'll understand that his fort was right smack dab in the middle of that establishment. Okay? Now, Heath was not the first HBC tenant farmer to live on this site. John Flett and his party was. Now, John Flett will come here in 1841 as a tenant farmer for the Hudson Bay Company with 22 other families. And the motivation for him being here was, at this time, this was still the Oregon country. And the British wanted to establish a stronger British settlement footprint, particularly north of the Columbia River. So Flett would arrive here, but like so many others that would sometimes experience the Hudson's Bay Company, the Hudson's Bay Company kind of reneged on the promise of what would be here when his party got here from the Red River Colony near Winnipeg, and they would become discouraged and leave, and they'd go to the Willamette. However, Flett will return in 1859, and from Flett will grow the town of Lakewood, Washington. I remember the Flett Dairy. I don't know if you remember. That was part of his family indirectly, all right? So, what were the terms of the contract for Joseph Heath? His contract said that he would be allotted 100 to 500 acres. He would be supplied with cattle and sheep by the company. However, there was a 5% interest charge on the value of all capital, stock, and implements. 50% of his produce would go to the Hudson's Bay Company. He had to pay a 1,000 pound, I call it a damage deposit, in case by some chance he destroyed the wreck of the buildings that were already there and dilapidating and falling apart. The Hudson's Bay Company felt compelled. You're going to pay a $1,000, I just call it a damage deposit, they call it a surety. He didn't have the money, so his brother Thomas would pay that fee. And on top of all this is to me the kicker. The dilapidated cabin Heath would occupy that was there with the Red River colonists, he described as the winds from the four corners had free admission. And he talks about rain leaking and dripping on his face when he's trying to sleep at night. I mean, sounds like a horrible place to live. Dr. Talmy would indebt Heath another 10 pounds for that wonderful cabins they were providing him. Okay? I got a little bit of attitude there, don't I? Okay. Now, I'm just going to show you a few pictures to kind of create a perspective. This is Horton Squally. It's from the mid-1840s. But this is 1845. This is a Paul Kane drawing. Oh, I could use my pointer again. Here you can see this is pre-pickets or stockades around the fort. Here you see some Indian dwellings, Horton Squally, 1845. I'm going to jump you to 1869. This year, Horton Squally would close, but the reason I put this picture in here, number one, I just think it's kind of a cool picture, okay? But number two, it shows the scope of the business that will be established. What you see right here, Bastion. In Point Defiance Park today, this is the core of the fort that we've relocated. This building and that building are in Point Defiance Park today. But what you want to note here is all the buildings here and down here, cattle, sheep, and it illustrates the scope of the agricultural operation that Horton Squally was and intended to be. This is the man in charge, Dr. William Frazer Talmy. Now, he was the manager of Horton Squally. Talmy was a physician, and he began his work as a clerk for the Hudson's Bay Company. He would arrive here in 1833. He would actually spend 6 months at Horton Squally, but he would proceed on to northern posts closer to what we call Alaska today. But he would return to Horton Squally in 1843 as a chief trader. So my point here is that both Heath and Talmy are kind of like newcomers at the same time. You see what I'm saying? It's kind of an interesting dynamic that's going to develop here. This is an 1855, this is the Tilton Map that was presented here in Olympia. And what I wanted to show was the scope of the operation that Ptolemy was under control. This was the PSAC map, Puget Sound Agricultural Company map. And here's the boundary here. Point Defiance, you kind of picture here. Here's South Tacoma. And what it shows, all this is the plains country that once populated this area. Spootsilk, American Lake, Waiachi, Steilacoom Lake, Spanish, Spanaway. Horton Squally is right there, and the Heath farm is up here. So that's kind of their distance from one another, and it was walkable or rideable or rowable in that day. Okay? This picture in actuality, now we're kind of in the turn of the century, 1900s. But this is the James Sales farm. And I jumped here because I like the picture, number one. I like the fact that you see Mount Rainier right there. But it shows kind of the commonality that Heath and Ptolemy had, and that was their job was to manage successful farms. And I think this picture kind of illustrates that. As you read the journal, but you'll find out very quickly that Heath was the real farmer, and Ptolemy was an able but willing student, but really didn't know a lot about farming. Okay, so that'll form an interesting dynamic. So how do you summarize Heath's relationship with Dr. Ptolemy? Simply put, he liked and respected Ptolemy on a personal level. You see that all through the diary. However, he will take strong issue with Ptolemy when it comes to HBC management concerns. And that's where the conflicts will build that you see in the diary. The very first entry in the Heath Journal, January 1st, 1845, quote, rose at 6, rode to the fort, and dined with Dr. Ptolemy. Okay, so from the get-go, they have a relationship. Throughout the journal, they mention frequent gifts to each other. They're always exchanging gifts, books, information. And in the first 3 pages, Dr. Ptolemy will deliver to Heath a sheep's head as a gift that he's delighted to have, and he would cook it in the Scottish style. Has anybody had a sheep's head recently, or is that just off the menu anymore? I never see them doing that in Iron Chef. You know, they're just like, sheep's head. Okay. Okay. But the complaints will begin. And his complaints went along a business, way that, first of all, he complained that the Hudson's Bay Company was sending him refuse or inferior animals. The sheep and the horses he sent, he said, were not any good. He threatens that he will leave the farm at the turn of a straw, quote, if this matter is not rectified. He will even write a letter to Dr. John McLaughlin. He says, I want South Down sheep, which is a big terminal breed sheep, okay? Because the sheep you send me are little, runny, and underbred. They're inferior. He writes this letter and gives it to Ptolemy, and Ptolemy will look at it and says, it's a little testy. But anyway, he sends it anyway. But that was Heath. He wanted something done. What Heath didn't know was that the HBC itself felt that they were overextending themselves with him, that his character may have been known. So they were trying to kind of always hold back a little bit. And Ptolemy would inform Heath of these management decisions about him. And Heath would write, and this is March of 1847, quote, I made out a requisition for a year to fort. In other words, his supplies that he would send to the fort, that he wants the fort to send him. Usually had 4 gallons of spirits a year, but gave them up. And half the usual quantity of tea, sugar, and flour. Am determined that it should not be said, I am extravagant in my personal expenses. This reduction will enable me to pay for the enclosing of 50 more acres of land. And I think that's significant because he was willing to say, okay, the spirits is one thing, but the provisions, and he's always running out of provisions. Why? 50 more acres of land to make my business work. And I think that's significant about him. Ptolemy, in the beginning, in 1845, will take a little time to, Heath will have a little bit of time getting used to Ptolemy. And I just had to always include one quote that I've always enjoyed, because it really kind of sheds light on the times and Heath's intellect and what was happening in the world at that time. The setting is that Heath's neighbor was an English shepherd by the name of John Edgar and his wife. And he lived down the road, and I'm not sure exactly how far down the road he lived from Joseph Heath, but Edgar would have to ride, you'd have to ride a horse to get to each other's farm, or you could walk. It'd be a long walk. And Heath approached Ptolemy, could we have some horses to go visit Joseph Heath? And Ptolemy said no. So Heath would lend Edgar and his wife horses to return home. And he will write in his journal, think it will shame the doctor, who is a socialist, and tells me his sole aim is to contribute all of his power to the happiness and comfort of all those about him. Am of a very different opinion myself, his sole object being to amass money by any and every means. Without exception, he is the meanest being I have ever met. Yeah. So, but to summarize, that's the exception. I just like to read it because he talks about socialism. This is like what I say, 1845. Okay, you see what's happening in the world. The majority of the interaction with Ptolemy is positive. They had many frequent visits and many dinners together at the fort. And one notation, Heath mentions that he was sorry he wasn't able to shoot this particular deer because he wanted to give half of the neck meat to Dr. Ptolemy as a gift. And that disappointed him. They were both educated men, and that was a rarity in this time and place. At the end of the diary, Ptolemy will pay frequent visits to Heath because Heath, through all of his diary, is suffering from ill health. In the spring of 1849, as Heath is going downhill quickly, and this is, quote, sent for the doctor who remained with me all night, bled, blistered, and sweated me. I don't know if that's such a good thing or not. But that was the medicine of the time, okay? Now, a couple quick notes, and we'll move on about Heath's health, because I kind of mentioned it. When you read the Heath diary, he's helping hundreds of sheep being born. He's harvesting, planting wheat the old-fashioned way. We're not talking John Deering it here, okay? Well, you know what I'm saying. Okay, anyway. And he does all this hard work with a chronic health condition. In February of 1845, you see his first reference to taking the infamous blue pill. For those who read, you know, he just, all through this diary, he'll take the blue pill. Another word was blue mass. And a blue pill, here we go again, was a mercury-based medicine that also could contain digitalis and squills. Of course, you know what squills are. I don't either, yeah. They're a sea onion. That clears it right up, doesn't it? Yeah. And I guess their effect is they act as an expectorant. But anyway, they had squills in it. Throughout his diary, he complains of constant spasms, difficulty breathing. He's unable to walk upright. And in the end, he talks about his legs being swollen, twice their body size. He has chest pain, body pain, right side pain, and he's coughing blood. So he's going downhill fast. The second thing about Heath is his emotional health. And this, okay, Heath longs for his home and his family throughout his entire diary. He wants to go home. At the beginning of his diary, he will mention no letters from England for me. I fear they must have been left on board the ship. Kind of matter of fact. Okay. By late 1847, he's saying, dreadful, irritable, and out of temper, fretting from morning until night, can think of nothing but having no letters from home. And then the next, entry has one sentence that says nothing but fretting, fretting, fretting. And that's throughout the diary. He's always questioning, why am I not getting letters? My family's not sending me anything. Have they forgotten about me? And just about the time he dies, they start to get the steamship line that will allow letters or correspondence to go from England to the Isthmus and then up the coast by steamship, and it's going to cut time dramatically in getting information. And he hears about it, and he's excited, but he'll never get the benefit of this new technology. This is another Paul Kane. It's entitled Indian Lodge, 1845 on Puget Sound. The reason I put this in here is there's one portion of the diary where Heath goes after an Indian because the Indian had did something that he didn't like. He had a conflict. And he describes the Indian is going to take refuge in his lodge, and Heath will start to tear it apart to get to him. And this is how I picture the lodge that he started to tear apart to get to the Indian. So the next group we'll talk about is his relationship to Native Americans. Again, ladies and gentlemen, it appears all through the diary. I mean, we don't have enough time to discuss the Native American relationship because it's extensive and you have to read it. But I did find a quote from June of 1847 that he made upon a visit from Dr. Ptolemy, an American of English descent, John Jackson, who was the county sheriff. And I will quote, and I think just sums it up. Jackson told me that my farm put him in mind of the old country and that everything was better done than anywhere that he had seen in Oregon. But that I have been told before by every American who has been here, which is not gratifying. It's entirely Indian work. That's it. His farm, when you read the scale of the operation, you're thinking, how is this Englishman, the sick man, pulling all this off? And you just come to the conclusion, it's the Indians are doing it. They're doing a huge portion of the work. From the moment that Heath starts to rebuild his cabin, he will make a notation, so this is in 1845, that immediately an Indian camp will increase in size, forming a complete village 400 yards from my house. So often where the Hudson's Bay Company men were, big or small, it would usually attract Native Americans because economic reasons, social reasons, political reasons, there was a mutual benefit. And next thing you know, there's a little Tellet's village popping up near his farm. He will acquire an able assistant who appears particularly at the end of the journal, but kind of disappears at the end, but you get the sense he's still there. His name is Clappot, or Clappot, or something like that. It's K-L-A-P-A-T, and I'm not quite sure how that's pronounced. Clappot? Do you have any ideas how that? You're the, okay. I was relying on you for that one, Drew. Yeah, okay, yeah. But I'm just going to, Clappot, okay? And he describes Clappot as the most invaluable servant, plowman, carpenter, in fact, everything. His right-hand man. Clappot, he picked up because he was turned away from the Cowlitz farm because he had 2 wives. So they kicked him out. And even Heath would make the comment, in his diary that 1 wife is probably quite enough. Okay, so they couldn't quite get used to that. It's hard to tell how many Indians Heath would employ on a day-to-day basis. It's impossible to tell, but you get the sense it's quite a bit. From maybe several to a half a dozen, in some cases where there was a lot of work, you're going to see 30. You mentioned 30 women helping me about the farm. And he'll give them names to identify them. And in one notation he talks of, and I'm just going to quote it, Peter, Paul, Patty, Jack, Tom, and Moses. He talks about Stud, I like that one, Tall Lad, and Lord Falstaff. These are all just names that he gave to his Native Americans. They traded Heath in provisions, salmon, deer, fowl, in products such as cedar planks and cedar bark, and the Skagits would come down to his farm to trade potatoes. You guys know the Skagits were great potato growers. Great potato growers, and the speculation was that they got the potatoes via the Spaniard explorers who brought them up to their neck of the woods. The Skagits will try to talk Heath into heading to their neck of the woods, again saying, you should come up to our valley trying to entice him, see what I'm saying? Because that's to their advantage. You know, we have better farmland than you'll see around here. The conflicts he had with the Native Americans, I'm just going to define as what was meant by a day's work. Constantly, you see the expression, he will send a worker away. I'm going to send somebody, this so-and-so, away because they're either working too hard, not enough, lazy, or I suspect he stole something from me, and he'll send him away. But he was always fair to him. There was an incident where he sent away a worker who he paid with an axe. He got mad, said the guy didn't work hard enough, went after him, grabbed the axe back, got back home, reevaluated what he did, and said, I was wrong. So he was always introspective to make sure that he was fair with the Native Americans. There's a quote. He would have a visit. He says, I had a visit from Dr. Talmy, who put out a feeler to try to see if I would enter into his system of engaging my laborers. And this was to tell them that they're going to be paid for 9 shillings a month for their work, but they'll actually be given 6 shillings in trade goods. So in other words, he's going to cheat them a little bit. That's what it sounds like to me when I read this. And he says, and his response to that is, I will act towards my people with the strictest justice. And he does not buy this way of doing business. The other cultural conflict that appears throughout his diary is the retaliatory nature of the Native Americans that were living on the Puget Sound. There was a case where a Klickitat man will die, and Heath will make the comment that this man was, I think, the few or the only Indian he came into contact with who did not have revenge in his body when he left. He left peacefully, not vengeful. Okay? He would write the Whitman Massacre in 1847, and I'm going to quote, and he said, the murder was done by, quote, Christian converts. And he'll go on to say, it will like prove my contention that the Indians are, quote, are incapable, quote, of imbibing in religious feelings. Their only religion is revenge. Okay? And that will appear throughout his diary. It's a retaliatory. There are murders. The Native Americans to retaliate against another culture, and sometimes it was 20 years ago. He talks about a 20-year-ago incident, and often the thing was to go kill the medicine man. And he will never be okay with this. And also, he will experience, in the late 1840s, the Snoqualmies are going to arrive on the Puget Sound, and there's going to be a lot of trouble with the Snoqualmie Indians. They're going to threaten Heath, and he says, come on up, kill me, take my head, but I'm skin and bone, so it doesn't matter. Or, he'll get intelligence from his Indians that the Snoqualmies are down at the beach, and he would say, fine, send them on up, I'm ready to start shooting them. He would never back down. There was cases where he even confronted them eye to eye and stared them down. So his bravery with the Snoqualmies, I was always impressed with. Okay, now, in 1849, there would be an incident at Horton Squally, the famous Indian fight of 1849, that some men would die, but that would kind of cap it off. But 1840s, Heath Journal will you start to see the Snoqualmie uprising. Darn. I was hoping Bud McBride would be here today because I want to show you a picture of his relative. Of course,
my great-great-great-grandfather.
There's your great-great-grandfather. Okay, I got to say something about him. Okay. This is John McLeod, and he was one of the many Scotsmen who lived on the Puget Sound. Let me see, I try to see if there's a family resemblance. I think there is in there. Yeah, it's kind of scary. I'm kind of like, whoa, yeah. He's one of the many Scotsmen, and by the way, I'm going to call him Scotchmen occasionally because that's how they're referred. I know they. Oh, yeah, I know. But they were Scotchmen. Scotchmen. Maybe they were saying something. Okay, in the late 1840s. Also in the diary, he is leaving the Hudson's Bay Company in the late 1840s. He's talking about. Now, do you know? Would he go back to the Hudson's Bay Company after he resigned in the late 1840s? Are you aware of the?
I think when he went to get gold in California.
Oh, he's one of those, huh?
He came back, collected his money. I don't think he worked for the company again.
Okay, okay. So that was one of his friends and associates. The other one I mentioned was John Edgar, who was hired by the Hudson's Bay Company as a shepherd, and he too would end his engagement and just kind of blend into the life of the Puget Sound, southern Puget Sound. He really liked John Edgar. He described him as being straightforward, manly, educated, and this I found was an interesting comment when I think about the place and time, and has an independent spirit, which very few have in this country. Seems like everybody living here this time would have a pretty independent spirit. I don't know. That one always kind of struck me as kind of very dated, okay? Now, I got a quote. I'm going to quote your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. Okay, this is from January 2nd, 1847. John McLeod and Montgomery paid a New Year's visit, left with their eyes sparkling and not sitting very straight on their horses. So anyway, I mean, there's another one. I mean, I don't want to, you know, he worked and so forth, I guess, but you think about it, you know, he was often there to visit with Heath and, you know, like go see his buddy and have a few drinks, okay? Now, the other group I just want to take a second to mention are the Canadians. Now, the Canadians, I think, would just probably mean by the French Canadians. And the reason they're funny, because usually they're always comical when he talks about the Canadians. They were always humorous. And he says one day his house is taken by storm by 4 Canadians and their Indian wives. He was obliged to cook them 5 ducks, bread, in addition to the 6 pounds of boiled beef that he had already made. Okay? He said goes on, talks about they have great appetites and that they're known for eating 6 to 7 pounds of food per meal. Okay? Ptolemy, and he says, Ptolemy, he goes, these Canadians keep showing up and they're eating me out of house and home. And in the diary, Ptolemy will say, stop treating them so well. Stop feeding them. And that goes against his nature. He says it goes against my hospitality, but that's what he does, and it does end. They start coming by. Okay? Quote, house full of Canadians nearly the whole day. Half drunk, and greater fools than I have ever met with when in that state, either quarreling or kissing each other, gave them a bottle of rum and heartily wished them away. Now this picture I have here, I'll take a second to explain to you why I have. First of all, 1846, it's the Puget Sound, Inskip Bank, and what you're seeing here, here's Horton Squally here, horse track, the road to Heath, okay. Fiskard Island, today that is Anderson, okay. Dunce Island, McNeil. Here's Falusi Bay, Long Branch Peninsula, Fox Island. I think this would be Day Island up here. And the reason I put this map here is because in a big chunk of his diary, right in the center of it, is in May of 1846, the British are going to send 4 war vessels to the Puget Sound in response to the settling of the 1846 boundary dispute that would fix the 49th parallel between us and Canada. The boundaries line will be set. So they're going to arrive in May. The boundary line will be set in June. But the news won't get to the Puget Sound until the following fall. So that's a Heath's benefit because of the fact all these warships come in and anchor in this area here, just like a little bit of England has arrived on the Puget Sound, and he couldn't be happier, okay? And so you have Fiskard Island, Dunce, the captain of the Fiskard, okay? And this is a very happy time for Heath. There are many meals on board the ships. He gets frequent visits by the captains. There's horse races. In fact, you know the #1 spectator sport in the world this time was horse racing. It was horse racing, okay? There would be singing and dancing, and he'd get a gift of a cupboard and a set of drawers, and workers were sent to his farm to help him out. So this is a great time because he's just eating this up, all this interaction. However, November 1846, Ptolemy informs Heath that Oregon, 49th parallel and lower has been given up to the Americans. And his response that he writes is, "This put me out of spirits and out of temper, as I now must look for a new place to settle." Okay? And also, it means the ship's going to have to leave. So the ships will leave. He talks about seeing auld lang syne, the tear in his eye, and he says he has what the Indians call a sick heart. Okay, so it was not a good time for him. Oh, how'd that get in there? Oh, what? That's Charlie Ross. Charlie Ross. The reason I put it in there is the whole Ross clan shows up in the Puget Sound. This is the son of Ross, and it's just a great picture because and Heath will have interactions. He really respects the Ross family, and he has nothing but good things to say about the Ross farm. Okay. So now it's 1846 and beyond, so the complexion of the Puget Sound is changing. It's now American territory, and from this time on, you're going to really start seeing a lot of Americans coming into his diary. November of 1846, there's a quote that kind of marks his change, and I think this is the first arrival of an American. "Towards evening, an American of the name Hammond walked into my house," I love this image, "having an axe and a bundle on his back, a thorough Yankee." So we try to picture, well, who's coming here in the 1840s from the American, the leading edge of the Americans? I think that says it. Probably Hammond, I'm sure, was a young man. He had an axe. Guys, that's the tool you want. Makita power is not the way to go. You want an axe. It's the granddaddy of all tools. And a bundle on his back. That's the Americans arriving. However, about a month and a half later, he doesn't give them by name, but he mentions the incident, so I suspect this Hammond will return, and he's looking destitute and burnt out and dirty, and by what he says, Heath will say that he has the unenviable pleasure of his company for the next few days, which he cannot tolerate. So what he does in typical Heath fashion is he will give him a bushel of wheat, beef and pork. By that means, got clear of him and sent him out. Okay? But that's typical of Heath because he was always generous. Everybody who visits is either fed or given something, but he always treats him with generosity. But as time goes on through this phase, the later part of the 1840s, Americans will come by more and more frequently. In one incident, he talks about 8 stopping in for dinner. And what always interests me about the diary is that this is pre-cell phone, telephone. You can't call, "Hey, Fred, I'm on my way." You know, they stop in. And it's almost like, so he feels obligated to feed them and entertain them, and he seems like he always does with a pretty good attitude. But then it's always common to see him say, "But I was kind of glad they left." Yeah, he'll make that notation, "I'm glad to have the house back to myself." He also will make some interesting notes about his perceptions of Americans. One, he says he liked the way the woman talked with a nasally accent that he wasn't familiar with. I'd like to know what that one was. And he also makes another note that Americans seem to have a narrow perception of the rest of the world. Heath would have associations with Olympia founders Edmund Sylvester and Levi Smith. In July of 1848, now we're getting to the time when Heath will pass, Ptolemy and he will spend 2 to 3 days. They'll paddle down to Olympia, and they will spend that time touring American settlements. And for the most part, Heath is very pleased with what he sees. He sees good farms. He'll sometimes have a criticism like, "This person's got good wheat, but I was kind of surprised at how poor the cattle was." Or this person, like Thomas Chambers, great horse raiser, horse breeder, but his cattle weren't very impressive. But for the most part, he seems very, very favorable of the Americans, and you seem like he'll have a change in his opinion. Uh-oh. I probably hit it too many times. Oh, here we go. Recovered. Last picture. Actually, I took this picture out of the book that has his diary, and I just kind of liked it because of the fact that you saw the very, very first picture of his English, and it just looked kind of, that didn't look like Heath to me. This I kind of like because it shows Heath kind of the way I perceive him, okay, and I think the artist did a pretty good job. Sitting at a book or writing, and he often will mention that he will be writing until 1 in the morning. When he did finally, at the end of his diary, he would receive a box from his family, and he will just relish it and reread and read the letters over and over again. February 9th, 1849, his last entry in his diary, Heath will write, "Unable to do anything myself, my voice is gone." And his voice was gone. His health would degenerate quickly, but what's amazing is up to the mid-January prior to his last entry, he's still performing farm chores. That's what really amazes me. In fact, he will get into a fight with an Indian who goes after him with a knife, and he manages to break the Indian's arm in the fight. So he still has some kick left in him at this time. Ptolemy will move Heath to Horton Squally, and he'll die on March 7th of 1849. By July 25th that year, his farm is auctioned off, the farm implements are sold, and all of his remaining effects. By that August, the following August, so things are happening fast, Ptolemy will rent the Heath farm, the 20 acres around it, for $50 a month to the U.S. military, and we had the beginnings of Fort Steilacoom. And it wasn't, and because of some probate problems, the probate would not end until early in 1851, when his estate would be settled and cleared, and Heath's brothers and sisters would receive 300 pounds sterling in payment for Joseph's, what they call moiety. So they did get some return from all this work. And that's Joseph Heath's story. Okay.